Tonight, the culmination of one of the greatest dramatic moments in all of history. It's recorded in the Bible in the book of Genesis. You don't want to miss this. My name's Mike Rippey. I'm lead pastor at Evangel Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Welcome to the Fire Bible Study. If you've just scrolled past, you want to stay and listen for the next 25 minutes to this greatest dramatic story, possibly in the top 5 all in history. And those of you that are regular part, welcome back. Now, let me ask you if you would take a moment and like this and share this if you would. And we're going to dive right into this. So if you have your syllabus, we are on lesson 21. 21 lessons as we've looked at what we call In the Beginning God. This has been a chapter by chapter study of the book of Genesis. And we're getting very near to the end of this study. But we've been at this, 4 to 5 months looking at this tremendous book, the book of Genesis. So let me set the stage. It's kind of been a week, and so just to refresh our memories. Matter of fact, let me take you all the way back. Bunch of brothers. There's 11 of them particularly at this time, and 10 of them don't like the one at all. And he's a bit of a spoiled brat. Well, my goodness, they decide to kill him. And then a couple of the brothers have a little bit of conscience, say, well, let's not kill him, let's sell him into slavery. That way we don't kill him, but, he'll probably get dead, assume room temperature, going into slavery. So they do, they sell him. And his brothers think that he's dead. His father thinks he's dead. His younger brother, who wasn't really a part of the story at the beginning, thinks that he's dead. And he gets sold into slavery in Egypt, and through a series of events that we don't have time to even refresh tonight, he becomes second in command. Only the Pharaoh has more authority and power than he does. He's got the title of Great Vizier, and he's in charge of everything in the nation of Egypt. Well, the surrounding areas are starving. The surrounding countries are starving, which is where his father and these other 11 brothers and their family still live. And Joseph, because of his stewardship over Egypt and 7 years of great harvest and gain, and they stored up surplus, and now 7 years of famine. Because of that, people from all over the world are coming to Egypt to buy grain because they're starving to death. And these 11 brothers do. So they've been there already. And Joseph, who is fully Egyptian, has a fully Egyptian name, looks Egyptian, does not reveal who he is. Matter of fact, I'm certain that he spoke Egyptian and used an interpreter and all of those kinds of things with his brothers. Now, he finally gets them to go get his younger brother Benjamin. Because long story short, this father loved 2 of his sons more than he loved the rest. First one being Joseph, the second one being Benjamin, because they were of the wife that he loved. And so he gets them to go get Benjamin, bring him back. He gives them more grain, but then as they are leaving to go home, Joseph sets up a sting. And that sting basically was this. It's in your notes. We saw it last week. Benjamin's been set up as though he had stolen the cup of the Grand Vizier, which is Joseph. What would his brothers do? Of all the people, Judah, and you would have had to be with us for these 21 weeks to recognize the transformation that happened in Judah. He takes up and says, I'll take my brother's punishment. Judah offered the Grand Vizier to give his life in exchange for Benjamin. Judah was the spokesman for the whole group, apparently, and they were all willing to take Benjamin's place. There had been some real change in their lives since Joseph had known them earlier, and we had seen the last few weeks. He was testing them to see what they were all about. So let's pick up the story. Joseph could stand it no longer. Out, all of you, he cried to his attendants. He wanted to be alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept aloud. His sobs could be heard throughout the palace, and the news was quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless. I guess so. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. Now, I've mentioned throughout this story that Joseph here in the Old Testament is a type, if you would, prophetically speaking, about Jesus. And here we see another one, a stunning parallel, if you would, quite suddenly, in a dramatic moment, a dramatic atmosphere of Joseph's brothers facing prison because of Benjamin, and the setup there, the grand vizier suddenly declares, I am your brother Joseph. It was a sudden and quick revelation. In that moment, the brothers now fully recognized who he was. Notice this bullet. Write this in your notes. In the same way, one day Jesus will reveal himself. Write that in your notes. 2 words. Reveal himself to the world when he breaks through the sky at the second coming as the coming king. In particular, the Jews will suddenly know their, write this in your notes, Messiah, their brother, if you would. See the parallel? Who they have not recognized. The Jews haven't recognized Jesus as their Messiah. But there's coming that day, there's coming that time that they will recognize. John 1:1. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. That's his brothers, the Jews, if you would. Zechariah 13:1. In that day there shall be a fountain open to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. That's a prophecy about the sudden revelation of Jesus. Just as Joseph's brothers heard him declare, I am Joseph, your brother, the world will hear Jesus declare, I am Jesus, your Messiah. That's interesting. Joseph's brothers had long considered him dead and gone. They did not know of his throne, of that place of majesty, just as today's world, for the most part, doesn't understand the lordship of Christ and the fact that he truly will rule this earth one day. Absolutely. Joseph could not bear the moment. He burst into sobs so loudly, as we read, that they were heard throughout the palace. Can you imagine? It's been about 17 years or better since he was sold into slavery, and all that Joseph had lived through. Imagine the feelings going through the brains of his brothers. They must have been absolutely terrified. There was a dream. Remember, Joseph the dreamer, you're all going to bow down to me one day. And here it is at that moment. And they were the ones that were going to kill him and then sold him into slavery, and heard his cries as he's been taken off in a slave caravan headed toward Egypt. And now all the power is on his side. We're dead meat now, I believe they said in Hebrew idioms. They must have thought. But Joseph is not angry, nor does he seek revenge. Note this. Come over here, he said. So they came closer. And he said again, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Remember, they haven't said a word. They are speechless. But don't be angry with yourselves that you did this to me, for God did it. Now, you might underline that. That's one of the most powerful statements of God's sovereignty, and that God is the one that's going to work all things for good and for your good. So don't hold it against whoever that did whatever was wrong, unjust. If you're a child of God and you're walking with God, then it's God that did it. He sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. These 2 years of famine will grow to 7. So they're only 2 years into this famine, during which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God has sent me here to keep you and your families alive so that you will become a great nation. Yes, it's that promise that God gave Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph's father, Jacob. Yes, it was God that sent me here, not you. And he has made me a counselor to Pharaoh, manager of the entire household, and ruler over all Egypt. Now, Write a couple things down. These are worthwhile. Perhaps one thing that makes Joseph stand out like a diamond against black velvet was his ability to understand God's dealing in his life. I'll be honest with you, I don't always understand God's dealings in my life. And I'm quite a bit older than Joseph is at the time that he reveals himself to his brothers. Incredible spiritual maturity. He had an ability to understand God's dealing in his life. I pray that for you, and I pray that for me. Next bullet, there's something I want you to write down. We all too often consider life's events as something personal or a fate, rather than, write this in your notes, the hand of God. That's why we get so angry or put out and want to take matters into our own hands. But Joseph had learned an important lesson. Now listen to his invitation in verse 9. Hurry, return to my father and tell him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master over all the land of Egypt. Come down to me right away. You will live in the land of Goshen, so you can be near me with all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all that you have. I will take care of you there, for there are still 5 years of famine ahead of us. Otherwise, you and your household will come to utter poverty. Then Joseph said, you can see for yourself, and so can my brother Benjamin, that I really am Joseph. Tell my father how I am honored here in Egypt. Tell him about everything you have seen, and bring him to me quickly. Weeping with joy, he embraced Benjamin, and Benjamin also began to weep. They're full brothers. Joseph and Benjamin are half brothers with the other 10. So Joseph and Benjamin are very close. Write this in your notes. Notice this. Joseph wanted his family nearby. He wanted fellowship with them. That's what the Lord has always wanted with us. It's fellowship. All the way back to the garden, I mentioned God and Adam in the garden, God coming down in the cool of the day, fellowship. He didn't create us to be a robot who would just worship him in a mechanical kind of way. He wanted true fellowship. Pick it up in verse 15. Then Joseph kissed each of his brothers and wept over them. And I want you to underline this. Maybe I underlined it in your notes. I don't remember. And they began talking freely with him. The news soon reached Pharaoh. Joseph's brothers have come. Pharaoh was very happy to hear this, and so were his officials. So they're glad that Joseph has family to lean on. Now I underline that they begin talking freely with him. I would love to know what those conversations were about. Oh, I think Joseph would have a lot to say. He'd tell them about God's favor on him when he went to Potiphar's household. He would tell them about how he resisted temptation against Potiphar's wife, and yet doing the right thing, he was thrown into prison for several years. He would tell them of the incredible dream of the butler and the baker. One each had a dream, 2 dreams, and he was able to interpret them absolutely perfectly. And then, sometime later, he interprets the dream of Pharaoh and understands that there's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. I wonder if Judah got honest and told the story of his horrific life, of having children by a prostitute, of other horrible things, and yet Joseph has seen the change, the transformation in Judah's life. All the stories of these 17 years, the marriages, the children, their grandchildren, because we know that Jacob had great-grandchildren, so some of these brothers already had grandchildren. Can you imagine all the conversation that took place? So Pharaoh responds. He said to Joseph, tell your brothers to load their pack animals and return quickly to their homes in Canaan. Tell them to bring your father and all their families and to come here to Egypt to live. Tell them Pharaoh will assign you the very best territory in the land of Egypt. You will live off the fat of the land. and tell your brothers to take wagons from Egypt, to carry their wives and little ones, and to bring your father here. Don't worry about your belongings, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours." Now, the old King James in verse 20, and I put it here, says, "Regard not your stuff." Pharaoh says, don't worry about your stuff. I think that's a good way to remind us that our stuff too often gets in the way of what God would like to do in our lives if we would take a step of faith. Let me finish this little fill in for you. And we should not regard our stuff too highly in comparison with the magnificence of God's provision. What a picture of it. The difference here. They're going to have a land. Oh, it's our land. We've lived here all of our lives, you can hear the brother saying. Jacob saying that. And yet God wants to provide in Egypt the best land that is there, the fertile land that is there, favor and blessing and bounty, if they'll just let go of their stuff up there in the Holy Land. What a type of God this story is. Without Joseph, the brothers would have had no access to this majesty, the Pharaoh. Write this in your notes. Without Jesus, do you see the parallel? Without Jesus, we would have no access to God. So the brothers make their way back across the Negev desert into Canaan, where they brought the incredible news to their father, Jacob. So the sons of Jacob did as they were told. Joseph gave them wagons as Pharaoh had commanded, and he supplied them with provisions for the journey, and he gave each of them new clothes. But to Benjamin he gave 5 changes of clothes and 300 pieces of silver. He sent his father 10 donkey loads of good things of Egypt, and 10 donkeys loaded with grain and all kinds of other food to be eaten on this journey. So he sent his brothers off, and as they left, he called after them. Don't quarrel along the way. Isn't that interesting? As they left Egypt and returned to their father, Jacob, in the land of Canaan, Joseph is still alive, they told him, and he's ruler over all the land of Egypt. Jacob was stunned at that news. I guess so. He couldn't believe it. But when they had given him Joseph's messages, and when he saw the wagons loaded with the food sent by Joseph, his spirit revived. Then Jacob said, "It must be true, my son Joseph is alive. I will go and see him before I die." Can you imagine the heart of that father? It's revived. That's a good word. It's interesting that he knew his brothers. All he had seen of his brothers when he was growing up was their fighting and their quarreling and their nagging, and he reminds them, don't do that on the way home. Don't pit one another against, oh, he's going to get us when we get back. I'm sure there were those conversations, because we see it later in this book. After Dad dies, they're afraid. And so I'm sure there was a lot of conversation. If you hadn't done this, if you hadn't done that, oh, you were the one. No, he said, don't do that. Don't do that. And I put in here, down here in this paragraph, someday in heaven I want to ask Jacob how he did not have, quote, the big one, as Fred Sanford used to say when he learned Joseph was not only alive, but the leader of Egypt. Now, here's some bonus points for you, because I went old school. Tell me, what was the name of the show that Fred Sanford starred in? Give me a little clue. What was it? And he always would say, Elizabeth, I'm having the big one. Let me see how old you are, how quick you go to Wikipedia. If you find it on Wikipedia, let me know. But put it in the comments section. What was the name of Fred Sanford's show back in the day? Hilarious comedy. So, I wonder. You know, we're going to have a lot of time in heaven to ask some of these questions. I wonder if Jacob intended to stay in Egypt or just meet Joseph and the royal family to see him before he died. We'll never know. But Jacob never goes back into the land of Canaan again. He dies there. Only his bones make it back to Canaan. Chapter 46. Think a moment with me about Jacob and all his family pulling up stakes in Canaan and heading toward Egypt. It's a huge undertaking. So Jacob set out for Egypt with all his possessions. When he came to Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. During the night, God spoke to him in a vision. I want to speak about this in a second. Jacob, Jacob, he called. Here I am, Jacob replied. I am God. The voice said, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will see to it that you become a great nation there. I will go with you down to Egypt, and I'll bring your descendants back again. But you will die in Egypt with Joseph at your side. So Jacob left Beersheba, and his sons brought him to Egypt. They carried their little ones and wives in the wagons Pharaoh had provided for them. They brought their livestock too, and all the belongings that they had acquired in the land of Canaan. Jacob and his entire family arrived in Egypt, sons and daughters, grandsons and granddaughters, and his descendants. Now write this in your notes. It's important to note that before leaving Canaan, Jacob wanted to hear from God. Okay, time out. New job, new school, new neighborhood, new community. Anytime there's transition in your life, go to God. You want to hear from Him. You want His direction. Oh, well, Pastor's a no-brainer. I'm going to get this, and this with this new job. Oh, I can get this size house compared to where I'm living. Oh, I can... No. Don't depend on how you see things. Ask God for His direction. And He'll give it to you. Because in Jacob's younger days, he would have just gone head first into something. But he's matured. He's grown spiritually. He remembers that Abraham, grandfather Abraham, remember? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham went into Egypt and got into a heap of trouble. And you can go back in our notes and see that. And so here late in life, he decides he wants to hear from God. And God lays it out. You're not going to return from there, but while your family is there, they are going to become a great nation, and I will lead that great nation out of that land. God assured Jacob to go into Egypt. Now, the bullet there, fill this in. We will see all of this come to pass in our next study, Exodus. So I'm tipping my hand. When this study's over, we're going right into the book of Exodus, because we leave the children of Israel there in Egypt. That's not where they need to stay. Abraham was promised a land, Canaan, and they need to get back there. So our next study will be in Exodus. So 70 people will now enter Egypt, and I want you to see this. Here's the specific numbers. Family of Jacob. The family consisted of Jacob, his wives, 12 sons and 1 daughter, 52 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandsons. Dan had the fewest number of children, 1 son. Benjamin had the most. Funny, he was the youngest, 10 sons. Benjamin was not just a mere child when he went to Egypt in that dramatic first time. He was not just a mere child at that age. He'd grown up. Another interesting insight is in verse 28. Jacob sent Judah on ahead to meet Joseph and to get directions to the land of Goshen, and when they all arrived there. It's interesting. Now, Jacob trusts Judah. This is the one, when we have studied through the book of Genesis, that just was such a disaster in what he did. Then, verse 29, Joseph prepared a chariot and traveled to Goshen to meet his father. As soon as Joseph arrived, he embraced his father and wept on his shoulder for a long time. Can you imagine that? Now, this is Jacob's favorite son. Joseph wasn't sure Dad was alive. The dad thought for sure that Joseph was dead. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "Now let me die, for I have seen you with my own eyes and know you are still alive." I wonder what it must be like at God's throne when Jesus ascended back to God in Acts chapter 1. after being gone those, 33 years. What a grand reunion for Jacob now, over 21 years later. And Joseph said to his brothers and all their household, I'll go and tell Pharaoh that you have all come from the land of Canaan to join me. And so he does. He goes and he tells them. I've shown you here a map of Goshen and where they live, the most fertile part. Pharaoh kept his promise. And so Jacob's family's in Egypt. They're all there living in plenty while this famine is going on around the world. Jacob's family has access to Pharaoh because of Joseph. One last fill-in. Once again, we see the parallels between Jesus and Joseph. Our access to God is because of Jesus. Let us all therefore come boldly under the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. Wow, what a story. What a dramatic reunion and reveal. Oh my goodness. Oh my. Well, next week we'll come to the grand conclusion of this amazing story from Genesis. In the beginning, God. And then, as I mentioned, we'll continue right along with a brand new study. You can get the notes. We've got the first half of those notes done, and we're going to be getting more. They'll be at the church, or you can contact us online at Evangel Church, Montgomery, Alabama. I encourage you to do so. But until then, thanks for being with me. Like this and share this. It helps others see this and join in with us. Until next week, as we bring the conclusion to In the Beginning God, Pastor Mike Rippey, Montgomery Evangel Church. God bless you.